Hello, everyone. Welcome to our horror panel at PRH Fest, Nightmare Narratives. My name is Allie Gosselink. I'm a rural library director in South Arkansas, and I'll be your moderator for this discussion. The books by our lineup of authors today showcase the incredible range that exists under the horror umbrella. This diverse mix of stories includes an homage to slasher flicks, a haunted house, a vampire story, a tale of dark magic and witchcraft, and a whole variety of fresh indigenous terrors. A novella, an anthology of 21 short works, and 3 full-length novels, including 2 debuts. Truly something for every type of horror reader. Please join me in welcoming E.L. Elaine Chen, author of Slasher Summer, Max Doty, author of The House That Eats the Dead, Shane Hawk and Theodore C. Van Alst Jr., editors of Never Whistle at Night Part 2, Back for Blood, Cynthia Gómez, author of Muñeca, A.P. Thayer, author of Tapeworm. Welcome, y'all. You can turn your cameras on now, and we're going to go around in a circle and let you introduce your books and yourselves, starting with you, Elaine.
Okay, hi. My name is Elaine Chen. I'm the author of Slasher Summer, which is basically Scream meets The Breakfast Club. So, 7 old high school friends reunite at a remote cabin where a cult slasher movie was filmed, only to find themselves terrorized by someone dressing up as the iconic killer from that movie.
Max.
Hey, I'm Max Doty, author of The House That Eats the Dead. Uh, my book is about a couple that moves into a new house that they soon realize eats anything that was once alive, and that could include anything from, I guess, like a dead body to a piece of wood. And furthermore, they learn that when things are erased in this manner, they are erased from everyone's memory except theirs. This is at first terrifying and then starts to seem useful after a bit. So there's a bit of a turn there.
Cynthia.
Hello, everyone. My book is called Muñeca, and I pitched it as Bound meets Mexican Gothic. And it is a tale set in 1968 Oakland of a fledgling slash once witch who sets out to rescue a bespelled heiress and loses control of her powers and her heart in the process. Or maybe she gains control of her powers and her heart, depending on how you want to see it. So good to be here.
Shane and Ted. Shane or Ted. I don't know how y'all want to do that.
Yes, we could both go. Hi, I'm Shane Hawk. I'm a horror writer and editor of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma, even though I was born and raised in San Diego, California. Never Whistle at Night, Part 2, Back for Blood. And that we are. We're back for buckets of blood. It's all spilled all over the ground. 21 new stories, some returning, and this time with some illustrations. Each story has its own drawing from Brent Learned, an amazing Cheyenne Arapaho painter.
It looks great. Another great cover from Perry de la Vega, and the illustrations are in there. It was we read well over 100 submissions, and I think we're hopeful we've got all the best stuff in there. We really are excited for this book, and part 1's still doing really well, and we're hoping for even better for part 2.
AP.
I'm AP. My book's Tapeworm. This will be my debut. It's my take on a cabin in the woods story, except it's the California desert. And it's also my take on a vampire story where instead of being gothic, they're more body horror and gross and sexy.
Yes, they are all of those things. All right. So Max, we're going to start with you for our first round of questions. The house in this story is as much a character as it is a location. And I've known quite a few haunted houses in my life. I'm the 6th generation of my family to live on our farm, so the houses have seen some things. I think all of them have that in common. Like they are a character in my life as much as they are a place. And I'm wondering if there's a particular real or fictional haunted house that you feel attached to or that inspired this house that eats the dead.
Yeah, I mean, the genesis of this book it came from a conversation I had with my wife, who tends to sort of anthropomorphize many objects in our lives, from the car to the house. And so we would be inside, and this is during the pandemic where we're never leaving the house. We're sort of trapped inside it all the time. And sometimes we'd have a conversation like, oh, maybe we should sell this place and like find another one. And she's like, no, we can't talk about that in the house. We got to get out of here. We can have that. We'll take a walk and have that conversation. We're not going to do that in the house. And I think that was kind of the start of us, incorporating this house as like another family member and then thinking of it that way. And then I guess writing the story is kind of like the horrific, dark side of that kind of anthropomorphization. It's like our house is very nice, and I think of it as like a kindly pet or something. But what if that pet, grew fangs and decided to eat some people?
And yet you love it anyway, right? Because it is yours.
Well, yeah, it's kind of like
I
your
love
your
that
pet
part of the
wolf.
story. Like, right, like it's kind of a scary house, but it's her house. It's Claire's house. So, she gets attached to it.
Yeah, I think it's one of those pets where you're never 100% sure you can totally trust it, but you love it anyway.
Yeah. I have a dog that we think might be part coyote. She's kind of like
All right.
that. Cynthia, the people living in the fictional Del Valle family's estate are plenty haunted without the house itself being sentient. And I found that the where Muñeca took place is really impacted by the when that it's taking place. And I'm wondering if you can talk about why 1968 was the right moment to set Natalia and Violetta's story in.
Yeah, so I've always wanted to set a story in 1968. I'm going to really badly paraphrase what apparently is a misleading translation of Gramsci. It's a time when, the old world was refusing to die and kept trying to kill the new ascending world. And the new world kept refusing to die as well. And so all that struggle and tension is just fascinating. And, so you have, by example, you have the Black Panthers get founded in 67, and then Bobby Hutton is murdered in Oakland in 68. And you have student rebellions that are all around the world, and the Mexican government trying to crush that by murdering its own students. And then you have MLK beginning to get class conscious and then getting murdered in response. But then you have all these national rebellions and riots in response to that. So it's such an exciting period from a history nerd's perspective, which is what I am. And so I really wanted to set something in that kind of turmoil. And also, that tension is really good for a Gothic story because we have that push and pull of the old and the new. And I could set up I want this family as the landed aristocracy on their way out and refusing to let go. And Nathi is kind of the new and the threat and bringing all of 1968 with her in her own way. And then the tension comes from the street and the outside world to being very real and very intimate. Wait, I can't hear you.
I was
There
muted.
we go.
I think you can definitely see the parallels between what they're going through and some of what today's young people are going through. And this search for identity and this desire to be able to figure that out for herself without all of these outside forces and this pressure and having to hide and run around. Uh, yeah, I really thought that was an interesting choice to set it in that time period. It added a lot to the pressures I think that the girls are feeling to perform the expectations of their roles. All right.
And I really wanted it to be, sorry.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I wanted it to be at a time where there was real threat because women had very few legal rights, but where we could also see that was on its way out at the same time.
Yes. And that's exactly how it felt. There's the threat, the outside world threat, and then there's this internal threat, and the tension between them is really strong. AP. So if 1968 was exactly the right moment for Cynthia's story, I think the desert is exactly the right place for yours. There are lots of ways that the desert setting plays into the events, but also the general vibe of Tapeworm, and it makes it hard to tell what's real sometimes in the story. And I know the characters are having trouble figuring that out, but the reader kind of does too. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about why the desert makes such a good atmosphere, particularly for this type of surrealistic horror.
Yeah, thank you. I think the desert is historically a place where, you hear about mirages and getting lost, and there's all kinds of magic tied to deserts in stories for hundreds or thousands of years. I specifically chose Joshua Tree because of the deserts. It being a low desert, it's very different from a lot of other deserts. And, it's got all these round rocks that no one knows why they're there, if there was like a lake there once before. So it's all these things that really enhance this feeling of being hunted, of not knowing what's real, of not knowing if you're in a dream or not, that I really enjoyed. Um, the story came out of me taking a writing retreat there with some of my friends and just being there and being able to see like the entire Milky Way sky at night, which was just awesome, and seeing all the little plants and vegetation and life that's in this desert was so just different from anything I'd ever experienced that I really wanted to capture that in the book.
It's almost an alien landscape.
Yeah,
I
very
think
much so.
in the book you do a really good job of using that environment to kind of make this feeling of isolation. Like
Hmm.
there is nothing else around them except the nightmare that they're living through. And I think that kind of makes the nightmare itself a little scarier, even like there's nobody to go to for help.
Yeah.
All right. Shane and Ted. The stories in the Back for Blood anthology cover a wide variety of settings, but they have lots of other things in common. Indigenous stories, as you point out in the introduction, often resist neat, tidy resolutions in favor of letting readers sit with more realistic uncertainty. I think this makes Indigenous horror uniquely powerful. Why do you think Indigenous stories in particular tend to have this trait, and how does it connect them across the diaspora?
Well, Ted, you cooking something? I mean, in general, I think it just stems from a lot of our traditional stories. We don't speak for every single nation and tribe out there, but a lot of the stories that we grew up with or that we continue to hear from our grandparents, if they're still here with us, uh, either, time is totally cyclical in a lot of these stories. It could start at the end, could start at the beginning, middle, and then never conclude. Because in a lot of ways, that story is for you now to carry with you, and you can kind of write its ending on your own, if there is an ending. Sometimes the stories are just like that. It doesn't have to kind of comport to, I guess, the popular Western lens of, three acts and it's over and everything's cool. Oh, then there's a sequel maybe for more money, but sometimes stories just end there.
Yeah, I think, I mean, you don't have I know it's sort of cliche, but you don't have this linearity all the time, and you're not always held to it. And sometimes, you know, your grandpa will tell you a story or something, and he'll be like, "Okay, gotta go," and you're like, "Okay, the story's not because it's going to be finished later, so don't worry about it. We'll get back to it." We had done a panel somewhere else, and somebody pointed out that in a lot of the stories they end with like it's like a choose your own adventure moment. And I think so much gets layered into the telling of the story and what's happening there, that it starts to activate your part of the brain. Hopefully, that's like, I wonder, what if this happened? What if that happened? What if that? And while you're doing that, boom, the story is just over. So it doesn't follow this formula. There's not always a satisfying conclusion. And I think with the first one, some people remarked like, "Oh, these stories just don't kind of." But I'm like, but Steve Graham Jones covered that in the introduction. Sometimes the stories just end. Get ready for stories that just end. So again, the stories do what they need to do in that moment, I think, and the stories are living, and they can grow. And if you've heard it or you've read it, so now it's yours. So it's part of you. So it becomes something living, and stories have to live, right? That's how we live. So I think that's really essential part of it.
I think you really nailed it with that idea that the story is living. And I think these stories have a different purpose than a lot of what we're used to with Western based, even mythologies, even that far back. They're intended to wrap up and then teach a lesson, right? They have a very defined little kernel of morality inside of the story, and that's the point of the story. But a lot of these, the story itself is the point, and what you take away from it is what you take away from it, and that's different for everybody.
For sure.
But I love that that ties so many of the stories together, even though they are so different in so many ways. There's always an interesting, like, where is it going to stop? Is it just going to stop? Is it going to give me an ending? Like, I'm waiting for them to end,
Yeah, it's kind of that intentional ambiguity at the end.
Yeah,
And
and
hopefully,
it creates that unsettling feeling, even though it's 21 separate stories, the whole book ties together with this feeling of like very uncertain of what's coming next.
that unsettling, that's the key. Let's get it unsettled. But yeah, hopefully they keep folks up at night too.
Oh,
So,
absolutely. Yes, yes. Many of them will keep me up many nights, I promise. Elaine, there are references to a lot of cult classic horror stories in Slasher Summer. In the chat, someone said that this sounded like a perfect book for us children of the 80s and 90s. And yes, absolutely. Everything from the setting to the characters' names is referential. And I'm wondering if you can tell us what are some of your favorite, maybe lesser known pieces of lore that have made it into Slasher Summer? Make my TBR explode.
Oh, okay. So this is actually more personal lore. But I briefly mentioned the movie Wolf Creek, which I think is sort of like a lesser known horror movie. It's Australian from 2005, about a serial killer who preys on travelers in the outback. And I think it was actually inspired by some real life murders. And so the day that I saw that movie, I slept with the lights on that night because it was just like it freaked me out that much. It just tapped into all of my fears as a woman and a person of color who's been taught to be wary of remote locations. So I just have a very silly mention of it in my book, just to kind of help exercise the trauma of having seen that. So.
I felt like there are so many, like a lot of the references in Slasher Summer are used in kind of a tongue-in-cheek way. Like the references are self-aware and they are funny. But then underneath the references, underneath the role that the character is playing, they got into some really authentic human character development stuff. Like they're working on some real problems in their lives. Even though, like the setup is this familiar slasher trope. I really loved that.
Oh, that's great. That's great to hear because I think that was sort of my intent. Of the putting in all the references was like really really fun, but I didn't want it to be sort of the whole point of the book. That at the end of the day, that these characters are they are still people. So.
Yeah, and it's like it's fun and familiar, but it took a different turn than I expected it to, and I found myself continually surprised by like the authenticity of the characters themselves. On that note, we're going to go on to our next round of questions, but we're going to stick with you, Elaine, on the similar topic. So, as members of the Jump Scare Society, the characters in Slasher Summer played specific roles at this Rialto theater in their hometown, and they played specific roles in their own lives as well. Can you talk a little more about what the Jump Scare Society was and how the expectations attached to their old identities are like compounding their current situations?
Yeah, so in my book, the Jump Scare Society was the high school horror film club who also did Rocky Horror type reenactments at the local movie theater. And so I was playing with character tropes from the 80s, 80s slasher movies and, John Hughes movies, like the jock, the stoner, the nerd, and so on. So each character sort of superficially fits those descriptions. And so when these characters are reunited after a few years, and also being back in the small town where they grew up, it brings out their old selves. It's kind of like how you tend to fall back into the role of a child when you're, around a parent, or at least I do. I don't know about everyone else. And so they either fall into these roles or they chafe against them. And this affects the choices that they make and how they interact with each other. And, that has consequences. Um, for example, one of my characters observes that at her art school, she's just another goth. But, being back in her hometown, she acts more rebelliously, to remind people that she doesn't belong. And, of course, that, like I said, that has consequences. And yeah, and being a slasher movie, your choices usually, end up being good or bad. So,
I think it was interesting too how their the roles that they had played kind of impacts, like they think they know each other because they know these roles that they've played, and that turns out not quite to be the case, and they start acting in ways that the others don't expect because they're not following this like role they're expected to play. um yeah, this was such a fun character study, I thought.
yeah.
All right, AP, we're coming to you next. Tapeworm also follows a friend group. It's a very different sort of friend group. And this is only from the perspective of one character, Victor, instead of kind of rotating through the cast. And at times he's going through some really dark things. And it makes the visceral nature of the horror hit home in a stomach turning way as a reader. Does the same thing happen as a writer? Like, did you find it more difficult to distance yourself from like the viscera of the story when you're writing from inside of his head than it would have been if you were writing from an outside perspective?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I did, but not for the reason you might think. Writing in first person really got me into his head, and writing kind of like the gross, the stomach turning stuff was kind of fine. It was the parts that had to do with his relationship, how he thought about his friends, the anxieties that he had, and all that internal stuff that really, really brought me to some dark places when I was writing. Like I would notice that after several hours of writing, I'd just be like, just kind of like, I would feel gross. I would feel just anxious and frustrated and unhappy, and I would have to like kind of like wash that feeling off of me. And it had nothing to do with violence or anything like that, and everything to do with the anxieties that Vic was being put through.
I think it was pretty interesting that his character kind of he has the same affect. He's as horrified and disturbed by his life, even when it gets really, really crazy. Like he's equally horrified and disturbed by it when it
Hmm.
isn't as crazy. He just doesn't know what to do. I can definitely see where inhabiting that space with him for a long period of time would be hard to do. He's got it bad, that's for sure.
Yeah, yes, he does.
All right, Max. This may be your first novel, but I did read that you're a frequent contributor to our No Sleep. Um, can you did well first, did The House That Eats the Dead start over there, or did you write it like start to finish as a novel? And can you talk about the difference in writing between the two formats?
Sure, yeah. This did start as a no sleep series. Actually, it was the winner of like the 2023. It was like the best series on no sleep that
Oh,
year, and that's kind of how I think my agent interested in me. But yeah, writing as a no sleep author was really different. I was basically like writing at night, and I would just write for 2 hours, and then I would just basically hit publish on whatever I'd made, and I'd kind of like, I feel like social media is like a horrible, addictive thing that like ruins our lives. But I had rewired myself to uh like chase that dopamine rush by writing a story and getting feedback on it. So I would just every night publish something, get feedback, and feel sometimes good, sometimes bad if people didn't like it. So yeah, I guess I was just going by the seat of my pants. No, the House That Eat the Dead started as a series, and I would publish it, not even kind of knowing what was going to happen next. It was almost this like improving the whole thing. And then when I actually got the agent and like the chance to turn it into a novel, I slowed down. I actually had a chance to, go back to the first scene and change things. That's something you can't do if it's already been published online and people have read it. So Yeah, I slowed down. I guess the other part of No Sleep is it has to be extremely like hooky, and you barely have time for characterization because people expect that like horror hit really, really fast. In a novel, you're going to sit down and you get that grace to actually take your time, expand your characters, and people aren't just going to ditch you when like a butterfly flies by or whatever. So yeah, I had the time to really slow down the story, get really deep into character, and think like, why did the house pick this main character and this family? And I kind of like that was the sort of like light bulb that took it from like a pretty fun No Sleep series into a novel that I'm really proud of because I think I discovered things about the characters that weren't there when it was an online series.
Do you have a feeling about preference? Like, do you think you would like to start and write a novel straight through in a word processing document, or do you like the sort of parts writing of No Sleep better?
I will say like psychologically it's probably better for me to be doing just short fiction online. Like I just do it and then it's almost like I'm like happily going about my life for the rest of the day. When I'm like alone at my computer for months at a time writing a novel, which is like I've done subsequently now, like writing the next thing, it's like you're very up in your head and lonely and probably grouchier with my family and all kinds of stuff like that. But
Spoken like
you
an
know.
author.
That's I guess that's just like the cross we bear as authors. Yeah, when I was like the happy-go-lucky no sleep guy, that was really cool. But also uh it you don't get paid and you also maybe don't have access to the same readership. So that's kind of like the trade-off.
That's awesome. I'm gonna go back and find some of your old stories and read them.
Scary Max, that's me.
Awesome.
You go find me.
Cynthia, my next question is for you. So, the Muñeca is a novella. It is so deeply layered and it really packs a lot into a short number of pages. I did not finish it and think that it had been novella length because it just is such a full and complete story. Um, Even the title itself is symbolic on multiple levels, and I won't get into too much of it because I don't want to spoil anything fun. But I'm really curious about the initial spark that this story unspooled from. So if you peel back the onion of all the layers of symbology, like what did you start with for this?
So I started this novel while I was pacing around the very kitchen where I'm sitting now. And I had this image from a lot of tropes, a lot of movie tropes of somebody who is trapped inside their body and can only breathe and move their eyes, which is absolutely terrifying to me, as I'm sure that's supposed to be, right? And so what I thought of was, all right, how did she get that way? Did someone deliberately get her that way? And if so, why? And I'm not going to answer the second question because there's spoilers involved, but the answer to the first is magic because I like writing about magic. That's what I do. And so that also is the only hope of saving her is magic. And then that led to the question of, all right, well, then someone's going to come in and try to save her. And already I knew, like I wrote, this is Sleeping Beauty, but not. So I wrote, all right, well, who's going to be her would-be savior then? And I didn't want it to be a dude because that's been done and it's not interesting to me. Um, and then that allowed me to, and then I realized that this is also getting kind of gothic, which I happen to really love. And so that allowed me to pull in two wishes, which is I'd always wanted to write about 1968, and I'd always wanted to write about the land loss in California and the Californios and the old Spanish colonizers getting robbed of their land, which they in turn had robbed from other people, and the irony of that. So I was really happy when I could figure out a way to weave them all into one story. And so that's what we have.
I love that. And that's kind of like how when I was reading it, I was like, okay, this layer and this layer and this layer, and then it just keeps building on itself. It was so good. I loved it.
Thank you.
All right. Shane and Ted are up next. The concept of a threshold is what I want to talk about with y'all. So there's a concept in librarianship we call mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors, and that was coined by Dr. Rudine Sims Bishop. And it's kind of this idea that all readers need stories that reflect themselves back to them and allow them to step into stories of other experiences. And so this concept of a threshold comes up in the introduction for Back for Blood. And I'm wondering if you can explain how this book in particular serves as a threshold and between what spaces it's allowing readers to pass.
There are a lot of thresholds, aren't there? And there are a lot of doors there. And I think, in my story, there's fire escapes and alleys and gangways and all of these passages. And you bring up a really good point. I think we've been through them, and we're looking forward to going through ones we haven't been through. And we're hoping, I think, to bring a broader readership with us, right? And so the threshold is there, and like the story, do you cross it? How does this end, and what's going to happen if I do this? And so I think there's this sort of the underpinning, because the subtitle Back for Blood is serious. We wanted like full on horror. I did a lot of sort of unofficial polls, and at academic places, and at book fairs and panels, and what people want to see, and overwhelmingly was like more horror. I was like, we can do that. We can do that. So when we went back in,
and you did.
and some of these stories we're like, oh my God, there's some intense stuff here. But I think people felt genuinely comfortable in letting that out of the bag. Like, let's go. If that's what you guys want, let's do this. And I think the responses are there. And so for big horror fans, Shane and I are both big horror fans. I write horror, crime, and humor, as well as edit and stuff. So we're into it, and I think making that space available for people to cross over, both the writers and the readers, and then booksellers and librarians too, because they know what they're getting, and they're like, wow, here it is. I think that's what we wanted to put together, and so those thresholds are there for readers, writers, and everybody else. What do you think, Shane?
Yeah. I think, yeah, it has different meanings when we used it in the intro. We were, thinking about it in all the ways that Ted just described, but also in the intro, we're kind of speaking both to native readers, indigenous readers, and then maybe non-native readers, either new to the series or coming back. And so I think we were trying to set up the book with that introduction with what to expect and what to leave behind when you pass that threshold into our world of stories, even though it's so varied and diverse across hundreds of nations. So we were trying to set up the expectations really. Here's what not to expect. Here's what to leave behind at the door to not carry in with you. And we go into all the myths about indigenous peoples, and how we're expected to be savages and beasts, or in the modern terms maybe we're only useful for our cool monsters like the W creature or the S creature, and we've seen online and everywhere how that's kind of been convoluted into something that's just like a weird greedy thing or a shape-shifting thing, and it's so far from Dene cultures and Algonquin speaking tribes too. So we were just kind of setting up a lot of kind of things that we noticed after publishing the first anthology of stories, all the things we've heard online in reviews, at book signings and all sorts of stuff, good and bad, of course. But we kind of just wanted to open it up by saying like, hey, here's what it is. If you enjoy it, that's awesome. And here's what to expect really. And that's exactly what an intro is supposed to do, I guess. So
yeah, and it does a great job. I felt like it really I like the threshold concept alongside the mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors concept as sort of a preparatory step, right? Like, set down your expectations, set down whatever you thought you were taking into this story with you, and then take the next step. I really loved the introduction to this. I thought it was
I appreciate that.
extremely it was a very good introduction to what was going to come next. I felt, not that anything can prepare you for some of what does come next, because there's just no preparation for some of that. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
no
felt like I
spoilers in the intro.
understood, a little bit. Yeah.
For sure.
Okay. I do want to remind our audience that if you have any questions for our authors that we are not picking up on in the Q&A, or in the chat, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will make sure that we get to them at the end. I have one more deep round of questions and then an easy round of questions for you. So we're going to stick with you, Shane and Ted. So every single story in this book is so different and so good, and I cannot imagine what an emotionally charged undertaking it must have been to try to decide and cut. And what sorts of balance were you looking for in making your selections, and what do you hope readers, particularly Indigenous readers, will take away from the collection as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, for the first book in this book, I repeated the process of creating a spreadsheet. I'm a non-type A type of person. I'm very disorganized. I have stacks of books behind me. But a spreadsheet really makes this process a lot easier. So for a lot of these stories, for part two, we had, I think it was like 154 submissions, which is pretty good because, there's not a ton of native horror writers out there. And with these books, we're trying to create more, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, man, we had so many factors, so many columns to kind of decide. And, we were trying not to overrepresent, say, Navajo writers, or not too many Cherokee writers, or what have you. Not too many people from the same region, not too many overlapping of the same creature. There's so many different things that we had to consider. And then the tone of each one, the themes, the motifs. We didn't want, total overlapping across the stories. And then, laying out the story order, the table of contents, we had to consider that too. And so I think with this new set of stories, we were trying to show to both non-native and native America that this is who we are. There's so many different ways that we can tell stories. There's so many different viewpoints, even though, we're still seen as monolithic, that there's so many different types of horror, even within Indigenous horror or native horror, however you want to call it. And so with these stories, we thought it was the best selection we could go with for the submissions that we got across all those several factors. And we ordered it in a certain way to kind of hit you hard, and then, you calm down a little bit, hit you hard again. And there's some really deep, dark ones, as you've read, that deal with a lot of real life terrors that our family members have dealt with, or ourselves.
I just want to add, I think, as for Native folks, as in this country's diverse people, we're those diverse group out of all the diverse groups, right? Well over 500 different tribal nations. There's a lot of diversity within there, and we wanted to show that. We wanted to have, again, we did established and open call writers, new writers, emerging writers. We have a good mix of that. We tried to balance it in that way. But I think one of the things got a little bit missed in the first one, but Shane touched on it a little bit, is that Native folks are still here. It's really contemporary, so there's a lot of really contemporary things. Even if it's like if it's in the 80s or whatever, it's still contemporary. It's not the 1880s, And it was really important to show contemporary Indigenous horror. And they're not always people are like, oh, I thought it was going to be traditional. I'm like, it's not an anthropology book. This is a horror book, right? This is a horror book of fiction on top of it. So I think it was really important to us to show both the diversity and the contemporary as well as traditional work within it. It's really rich. It's really broad. And hopefully more people come to Indigenous horror.
I know that I have shed many tears over end of the year best book lists for various groups that I work with, just trying to decide what belongs on those lists. And I can't imagine like the emotional weight of trying to decide which of these stories you're going to include in this book and which ones, you have to let go this time for next time. So So congratulations for having survived that. I'm sure it was brutal.
Oh, this is tough.
Thanks.
Max, so all of the books for this session are exploring identity and expectations. In particular, the horrific nature of trying to exist in the space in between the two. And so in some ways, even though the house is terrifying, it seems to make Claire feel less alone. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, and what does it say about both Claire's life and contemporary American existence more broadly that this house is such a friend to her?
Sure, yeah. I guess, I wrote this book at a time when I had quit a corporate job and had taken on the mantle of stay-at-home dad. And a lot of my life, was just like talking to my like pre-verbal little 2-year-old son and not really getting much back. And or being essentially alone in the house or with him napping or something like that. And it's pretty lonely, and like you're kind of like talking to yourself or talking to the house. So I wonder if part of it is like that sort of fantasy of getting a response from the environment, and like having a companion. Uh, yeah. So I think it's probably that, like that kind of like we are, so many of us alone for so much of the time, and you kind of like crave someone to be with.
I loved how she kind of comes back to herself, like her pre-mother self, the longer she spends in the house, right? Like she has this friend, and it kind of in a way eventually makes her feel understood and seen, and that helps her come back to maybe the less calm parts of her own nature.
In the story, I mean, she is a woman from like a working class background that's married up. She's married this very rich guy, and kind of like taken on the identity of a rich man's wife, and has been kind of coasting on the identity for 14, 15 years, as long as she's been a mom. Now, she's in this new house that's giving her a chance to reclaim that kind of wild past that was so definitive to her when she was a teenager. Um, there's also like her first kid has gone off to kindergarten, so for the first time in all that time, like she was able to just play that role, but now she can't just play the role anymore. She has too much time on her hands to just be that rich man's wife. She needs to figure out something else.
Feels like a common story among many. Elaine, the characters in Slasher Summer aren't in high school anymore. They are just returning home from college, and so they're not middle-aged or even into their 20s yet, or well into their 20s, which, just as a side note, I think gives this book really great YA crossover appeal. I'm curious why you decided to choose those ages for the characters, and if you think it affects the personalities and their motivations in the story.
Yeah, I mean, I would like to say I chose the age because, it's a time of your life when, everything feels like a matter of life or death. And often you're questioning or embracing your identity. But but truthfully, that high school college age is just the common age of characters in, classic slasher films. And the very prosaic reason for that is that, the target audience for slashers in the 80s was teenagers, who love gore, and they also loved the communal theater going experience with other young people. And of course, like everyone else, teens want to watch characters that they can relate to. And really, teenagers and young adults are the perfect slasher movie victim or survivor. Because at that age, you feel a little vulnerable, you feel a little invincible. Of course, that leads to bad decisions, but you're also vulnerable because you don't have full adult agency yet. And very often, you've got your final girl, the last person standing, who is forced to find that agency in order to defeat the killer. And, a story like that has, a lot more impact when you're young. And yeah, that's the final girl. That's like a whole other panel discussion. So.
Cynthia said, and also you're in the physical shape to do all the running and hiding and dodging. Very true. I feel like they're a little reckless. There's something about that age that makes you maybe a little reckless, and it suited the characters perfectly. All right, AP. I have seen some of your short fiction described as a genre that you've coined nightmarism. And I'm wondering if you can describe and define nightmarism for us. And do you think that tapeworm fits in that bucket or not?
Sure, I'll keep it short because I know we're running out of time. I have a lot of like nightmares and stress dreams, and I wake up often and hallucinate in the middle of the night, like the entire world will be green, or I'll just see figures in the corner, or there'll be bodies in the bed next to me, and it'll take me a couple minutes to kind of like push those away. And so that's really informed how I write horror. And at least from my experience, I feel that all that stuff is so surreal and unreal, and yet so closely tied to reality that it's like, I mean, the dream world forever has been this like mirror of our own world. And so anytime I want to explore that, that's nightmarism for me. And yeah, I definitely think tapeworm falls into that.
Yeah, I think it does. I'm definitely looking forward to going back and reading Max's No Sleep Stories and some of your short fiction because that concept of nightmarism is really fascinating to me. I like that. I like a new genre. All right, Cynthia, this will be our last question because we are going to be out of time today. So, Muñeca is horror at heart, but it's got a lot of magical realism and historical fiction vibes. Can you talk about some of your influences and inspirations for Natalia and Violetta's story?
So besides the Mexican Gothic and Bound, there are a bunch of others. My working title for this was When Rebecca Bluebeard Sat by the Firelight Discussing the Yellow Wallpaper with the Invisible Man. Not the H.G. Wells one, but the 2020 Elizabeth Moss one. And they would also be discussing The Little Stranger and The Handmaiden and Fingersmith. And I also realized just how much Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, whatever, influenced the magic in this and a lot of the vibes as well.
All right. That was very succinct. I love that. Okay. That is all I'm going to have time to get through today. I really appreciate y'all joining us for this session. This was fantastic. Our thanks to our audience also for being part of it. The chat was great. We had some good questions and commentary over there. Next up is going to be the final session of the day for the PRH Fest today, and that is the closing keynote with Jacinda Ardern. So that's very exciting. Make sure you go catch that next. And thanks for being here, y'all. Happy
Thank
reading.
you.
Thanks
for having
everyone.
us. Bye.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.